So good evening, everybody. I'm Adrian Talley, Superintendent of Indian Prairie School District, and tonight is our second Parent Academy, focused on student behavior, student discipline. This academy came out of comments raised last school year by some parents wanting to know how do we engage with student discipline and what practices do we need to follow. Schools are about educating our students. We approach their academic learning from an age-appropriate stance. We also approach how we respond to their behavioral issues from an age-appropriate stance. Tonight's discussion is about understanding what we currently do to address issues of student behavior, as well as how we respond to these issues on an individual basis. I think it's important to understand this is about understanding individual children, their needs, and responding to those appropriately. Sometimes some people want us to do global types of discipline, but we really have to look at individual students, what their needs are, and determine how we respond to those situations. It's all about educating. Just like it is at home with you educating your children, we want to educate our students as well about their behavior. So tonight, we will hear about the systems of support that are available to our students. We will discuss Senate Bill 100 and its impact on how we respond, gain an understanding of when students may be suspended out of school, learn what it means to expel a student, gained an understanding of special education and student discipline, and learned about the continuum of services, and finally hear directly from school administrators about how they approach discipline. Our speakers for tonight, Ms. Dawn Hinkle, partner with Engler, Callaway, Baston, and Saraga Law Firm, Dr. Nicole Howard, Assistant Superintendent for High School, Mr. Brad Hillman, Assistant Superintendent Middle School, Ms. Laura Rosenblum, Assistant Superintendent for Elementary School, Dr. Christina Sepio, Assistant Superintendent for Student Services, Ms. Leslie Mitchell, Principal Gregory Middle School, Ms. Terry Russell, Principal Brooks Elementary School, and Mr. Charles Bibb, Assistant Principal Waubonsie Valley High School. These skilled practitioners will lead us through the discussions. If you have any questions tonight, you are given a QR code that you can use to send us more questions, and we will get to them later on tonight. I will end by saying it is interesting in my professional and personal life, school discipline is something that comes up with all of my friends as we talk about how disciplining is happening with their children in their various school systems. So I understand how important this is to you as parents, because it has been part of my summer conversations with friends of mine over the last 30 years as we talk about this. So now I'll turn it over to Mr. Hillman, who will lead us in the next part of the presentation.
Good evening. When it comes to student discipline or student behavior within our schools, our main goal is to set all students up for success and to reduce the likelihood of student misbehavior. These efforts are provided for the benefits of all students. They are universal supports that are implemented throughout the school and in all classrooms for all students. We accomplish this in many ways. We ensure adult presence during unstructured time, such as passing periods and lunch. We provide clear and direct expectations for students, and we work to develop meaningful relationships with our students. When it comes to focusing on PBIS, or positive behavior intervention and supports, these foundational practices include things like school-wide positive expectations and skills that are defined and taught, classroom expectations and routines that are consistent, staff encouraging expected social and emotional behaviors, and establishing procedures for discouraging unwanted behaviors. However, every now and then when things don't go as we would like them to, we do have to engage in some restorative practices that include working on building relationships between two individuals who may not know each other very well, practicing respect on a regular and consistent basis, taking responsibility for our actions and how we have impacted others, repairing relationships when they have been fractured, and the reintegration of students into the learning environment. Those are all part of the restorative practices that we utilize with students in the hopes of being able to keep them in class. That is one of our major goals. We also have worked to build collaborative relationships with our school resource officer, otherwise known as the SRO. School administrators and the SROs strive to provide an educational environment centered around student safety and learning. As an SRO, their focus is on providing redirection and guidance and engaging in educational and relationship building activities. They are there to be another adult that is trusted by students to be able to positively interact with and go to when there is a negative situation that they're experiencing for guidance and assistance. Now I'm going to turn it over to Mrs. Rosenblum, who is going to talk about some targeted supports for various students.
Good evening. As Mr. Hillman shared, we have many universal supports that are available for all students. Our next layer of support is targeted supports, and those are really designed and put in place based on the needs of the students. I feel very lucky to be here in 204 because there are many, many interventions and support that we provide to students. I'm unfortunately just going to name a few here. The other thing Mr. Hillman talked about is we do work really hard to provide students with what they need, but at the same time we balance that with also making sure that all students are able to learn. So there are times where unfortunately out-of-school suspensions are warranted, and we consider that the most serious response that we could have to a student when they make a behavioral decision. We do look for alternatives to that, however, and that was part of what I wanted to highlight. That includes perhaps using an in-school suspension or a detention. And really the key to those is that it allows students to remain in school where we can provide them additional instruction in terms of social emotional learning. If they have some skill development they need that would help them be more successful. If they need to repair those relationships with someone, they're in school and we're able to help them do that, or to support them with work completion, because we know that part of their success is coming back into school and being able to continue to learn. And I don't know if anyone's missed a day of school or work, but you come back feeling, very discombobulated and worried about what you missed and where you left off. So those are some of the benefits of us being able to have students remain in the school. In addition, Mr. Hillman also talked about our keeping kids in school philosophy. Our administrators and educators really value the time we have with our students and do want them in class learning as much as possible. So they do put a variety of systems in place, but they also know that they do need to address the behaviors that might be interfering with the learning of that student or other students. And so they really work to respond to that behavior to help change it. Our goal is to help kids learn from any of their experiences so that they can go forward doing better. So we always pair those consequences with additional support, reteaching, and information to lead to greater success. Mr. Hillman also already talked about restorative practices, but that's a key component because oftentimes if there's a fight or if there's another difficulty even between a student and a teacher, we want to make sure that we're working to resolve that conflict before the student comes back to class. Or if we have a heads up before an incident occurs, we of course would want to work to repair that damaged relationship before it would lead to a suspendable offense. We also do work on increasing our parental contact. Some of those proactive communications, just reaching out to the parent and sharing with them, hey, here's what we're noticing at school, and what are you noticing at home, or what is your child saying about school, and how can we work together as the parent, the school, and with the student to resolve those issues to lead to greater success. As I mentioned, there are times when students do have an out-of-school suspension. We always want to have that re-entry meeting, and that's really when the student returns to school. We want to, again, make sure that we are setting them up for success and that they know and we know what's been learned from this experience and what the expectations are going forward. And then we do offer continued follow-up so that we do continue to check in with the student or with the family or even with the teacher to find out how things are going and what else we might be able to do. And then finally, we also offer referrals or counseling support. We have wonderful partnerships within the community, and we know that some families just need more than what's available at the school, and so there's wonderful resources that we can connect them with. Next, you'll get a chance to hear from Dr. Howard about some of our evaluation practices.
Okay, good evening. So evaluation is critical in assessing the effectiveness of our interventions and supports. So at a very high level, district leaders like me and Ms. Rosenblum and Mr. Hillman over there, we meet with our building level leaders and we discuss behavior scenarios. We look at equity across our student groups. We're looking in particular to find out if some of our students are responding better than others to our interventions and our particular supports. We analyze trends for potential bias. Do we have some students who are being referred for certain infractions more than others? Do our consequences look similar across our student groups? And how can we better support our students? Do we have the right interventions in place for certain needs? We look at this data also from a school level. And at the school level, they get into some of the individual student infractions and they do some of the same types of analysis. Is this particular plan working for this student? What additional resources may we need? Who do we need to consult with if we don't have the knowledge in-house to best support a student? What other programs can we connect a student with? Because when students are more engaged and connected, they tend to do better in school. You know, there's a lot of research around that. And we also look at, do we see any bias in the types of referrals again? Do we see certain teachers referring more students than other teachers for the same infractions? And a part of those conversations is always looking at and ensuring that we are being in compliance with the law. We have to ensure that we have intervention and consequences in place that meet the spirit of Senate Bill 100. So I'm going to turn it over to our attorney, Ms. Hinkle, who's going to talk about that.
All right, thank you. So Senate Bill 100 was passed by both houses of the General Assembly on August 24, 2015. And that's when it was signed into law by the governor. It had a delayed effective date, though, so it did not actually become effective until September 15, 2016. And then when it was enacted, it became Public Act 99456. But it is still widely referred to as Senate Bill 100, so you are likely to continue to hear that term. The purpose of Senate Bill 100 was to address concerns relating to the school-to-prison pipeline, and that generally refers to very punitive and exclusionary disciplinary practices that have the effect of funneling students out of schools and into the juvenile justice system or the criminal justice system. And the legislation sought to address that in a number of ways. And everything that I'm going to talk about here was both in Senate Bill 100 and is still part of the law. They were made parts of various sections of the school code. So these are all still effective. So the legislation specifically stated that among many possible disciplinary interventions and consequences available to school officials, exclusion like suspensions and expulsions are the most serious. The law went on to say specifically that school officials shall limit the number and duration of expulsions and suspensions to the greatest extent practicable. The law also eliminated zero tolerance policies. And on that issue, the law specifically said that unless it's otherwise required by law, school boards cannot implement zero tolerance policies that require school administrators to expel or suspend students for particular behaviors. So for example, school boards cannot have policies that say a student must be suspended or expelled if the student engages in fighting on school grounds. The legislation also added a section saying that school districts are encouraged to create memoranda of understanding with local law enforcement agencies And the purpose of that is to ensure that there are clear parameters and clear expectations for the role of law enforcement authorities on school grounds. School districts also are required to make reasonable efforts to provide ongoing professional development to teachers, school board members, school resource officers, and staff members on a variety of topics. And those topics include the adverse consequences of school exclusion and justice system involvement, effective classroom management strategies, culturally responsive discipline, the appropriate and available support services to promote student attendance and engagement, and developmentally appropriate disciplinary methods that promote positive and healthy school climates. With regard to students who are excluded from school, the law requires school districts to have policies to facilitate the re-engagement of students who are suspended out of school or expelled or who are returning from an alternative school setting. And the law also says that school districts are required to provide students who are suspended the opportunity to make up work that is missed during the suspension for equivalent academic credit. Generally, the law provides for increased accountability and transparency when a student is excluded by requiring school districts to give parents and guardians more information about why their student was excluded and why the particular length of exclusion was chosen. In addition to all this, one of the most significant changes was the addition of parameters for when school exclusions can be implemented. So we're going to move on to out-of-school suspensions. And the law addresses out-of-school suspensions in a couple of different ways depending on the length of the suspension. So out-of-school suspensions of 3 days or less can be used only if the student's continuing presence in school would pose a threat to school safety or a disruption to other students' learning opportunities. And then the law addresses longer suspensions differently. So on that issue, the law says unless otherwise required by law, out-of-school suspensions longer than 3 days can only be used if other available disciplinary and behavioral interventions have been exhausted, and the student's continuing presence in school would either pose a threat to the safety of other students, staff members, or other people in the school community, or would substantially disrupt, impede, or interfere with the operation of the school. The legislation also says that school officials have to make all reasonable efforts to resolve the threats, to address the disruptions, and to minimize the length of suspensions to the extent possible. When a student is suspended, the law requires that the suspension decision letter detail the specific reason for the suspension, as well as the rationale for the specific duration of the suspension. And the decision letter also has to include information about whether other interventions were attempted or whether it was determined that there were no other available and appropriate interventions. And the law says that students who are suspended out of school for longer than 4 school days are to be provided appropriate and available support services unless, again, it's determined that those types of support services are not available or appropriate. So next is expulsion. Generally, when we talk about expulsion, we mean a long-term removal from school due to gross disobedience or misconduct. And that's a phrase that comes specifically from the school code. So the school code says school districts are authorized to expel students for gross disobedience or misconduct. The school code also says that school districts can expel a student for a definite period of time not to exceed 2 calendar years as determined on a case-by-case basis. There are also special provisions for weapons, though. So on that topic, the school code says that a student has to be expelled, must be expelled is the phrase used, for at least 1 year if the student brings certain weapons to school, to a school-sponsored activity or event, or to any other activity or event that bears a reasonable relationship to school, although there is some flexibility in connection with that. So with regard to those weapons, one of the first weapon that's specifically mentioned is firearms. So the law says specifically that a student who brings a firearm to school must be expelled for 1 year, although the superintendent's decision on the length of this expulsion can be modified on a case-by-case basis, and then the Board of Education can also further modify that. A 1-year expulsion also is required for knives, brass knuckles, or any other object that is used or could be used for bodily harm, and it also includes look-alike firearms. Although here again, the statute says that the expulsion requirement can be modified by the superintendent, and then the superintendent's determination can be modified by the board on a case-by-case basis. Generally, expulsions are subject to the same parameters as long-term suspensions in that, unless otherwise required by law, expulsions and disciplinary removals to alternative schools as well can only be used if other appropriate and available behavioral and disciplinary interventions have been exhausted and the student's continuing presence in school would either pose a threat to the safety of the student, other employees, or other members of the school community, or again would substantially disrupt, impede, or interfere with the operations of the school. Also, in connection with expulsions, the law contains the same language saying that school officials have to take all reasonable steps to address the threat, address the disruption, and minimize the length of the expulsion to the extent practicable. If the board does expel a student, the written expulsion decision has to detail the specific reasons why removing the student from the learning environment would be in the best interest of the school. And the decision also has to include a rationale for the specific duration of the expulsion and a statement again about whether other interventions were used or whether it was determined that there were no other available and appropriate interventions. So the takeaway from all of this is that school districts retain the authority to suspend and expel students, and it certainly is appropriate to impose suspension and expulsion in some circumstances, but those decisions have to be made on a case-by-case basis and within the parameters of the law. All right, we're going to move on to the next topic. Dr. Suffield.
Okay. Special education discipline can be rather complex, and typically when we have a student with special needs that presents as a challenge to the learning environment, we support them through what's called a functional behavioral assessment, FBA, and then based on that data, we develop a behavior intervention plan, a BIP, to support the student and to make them, give them strategies and make them more successful within the environment. This is a working document that can change to fit the needs of the student. If other behaviors present as challenges, we adjust the data, take more data, we adjust the BIP, and we continue to try to support that student as best we can. If a special education student does reach 10 days of suspension, we hold what's called a manifestation determination review with the IEP team to discuss the behaviors leading up to the suspension, as well as the causality to the disability. We would never want to penalize a student for behavior that's a result of their disability. So we have a targeted conversation with the IEP team to discuss that. If in some cases we adjust that behavior intervention plan as a result of the MDR, the Manifestation Determination Review, for further supports, and in other cases we may adjust the IEP to provide additional supports, whether that's instructional, behavioral, related services, and we look to other supports that we can give the student. So when we look at the continuum of services, and that is the supports that that are available to students, many of these supports are not exclusive to students with special needs. We have a wide variety that we use both before students have entered into the special education arena as general education students, as well as supports that they can receive within the special education department. These services are flexible and a student can receive a variety of them at one time. A relatively newer support that we have introduced in the special education department is the services of a board-certified behavior analyst, as well as the services from a registered behavior technician. And these services are for students that need more adult support, more targeted adult intervention in order to be successful in the learning environment. But certainly, many, if not all of these supports are available to all of our students.
All right, at this time, we're going to ask our school leaders to take a seat, and we're going to have a little Q&A. So prior to this meeting, we had some questions come in from families, and there were a couple of questions that we put on ourselves because we get them on a regular basis. So we thought we would start with those, and then we'll move into some that we received via email or the form. And then if we have time, I think we'll take some more from our current audience. Okay, awesome. So we will start with our first question, which is, what factors do you consider when determining consequences?
Good evening. My name is Terry Russell, and I'm the principal of Brooks Elementary School. So I'll be speaking on behalf of what we sometimes call our littles, our youngest students in the district. The first thing that we think about when looking at consequences is really even before we get to that point. Our presenters tonight have talked about the proactive strategies that are in place for our students, hopefully to minimize the behaviors. Despite those, we know that sometimes negative choices are made by our students. And so when we're determining consequences, we really think about the same things that we do at home as parents. We want to make sure that a consequence is going to extinguish a behavior. So that is the goal, is to minimize the opportunity for that behavior to happen in the future. So one of the things that we consider certainly is, what is the offense? They can be from something very minimal to something more serious. So we look at that continuum of what the offense was. Dr. Talley mentioned developmentally or age appropriate. A 5-year-old behavior, that consequence might look a little different, obviously, than a middle or high school consequence. We also look at patterns of behavior and looking at what those previous consequences were that were put in place. Were those consequences effective or not, and looking at those patterns of behavior. We also look at the impact on other students. So for example, if we're talking about a student who's being disruptive to the learning environment in their classroom, that particular child might have an in-school intervention, which allows that child to work in a different location, still receive their services or intervention, and continue learning throughout the school day. It also allows the other 25 or 30 students who are in that classroom to continue their learning as well. We also have talked already this evening about restorative practices. We are becoming better equipped to really engage our students in that learning process. Just like we teach academics, we need to teach behaviors. We need to model, what does that look like? What does that sound like? And how can we collaboratively work to make sure that doesn't happen in the future? At the elementary level, we have a variety of sheets that we use. We call them processing sheets. Depending on the child, the age of the child, and the offense, we might select a different one. And the purpose of that processing sheet is to really engage the student in conversation, looking at what did they do, how it impacted them, how it impacts others, developing some of that empathy, putting themselves in someone else's shoes, of how that made somebody else feel. And then how can we, as a support system in their school, support them in making better decisions in the future. We also, under restorative practices, can look at quote-unquote community service opportunities for students. One of those natural consequence type consequences. And what I mean by that is, for example, if a student damages a piece of music equipment, maybe their consequence is that they come in at another time where it's private and confidential, but they clean musical equipment as a natural consequence to give back to what they have done. So those are a few of the things that we consider at the elementary level when we're determining consequences.
I'll just also, we do the same thing at the middle school level, but I also want to say that there's a lot of people that go into the considerations for determining what discipline a child is going to receive. So it's not just the principal, it's not just the assistant principal. We have people at the district office that we're asking. I never give a strong discipline consequence without consulting with my boss, Brad Hillman, and I know that my colleagues do the same. So a lot of people, a lot of factors are involved in determining a discipline consequence. Can I just read that? So the next question is what happens during and after a suspension? So during a suspension, we treat that no different than when a child is out for an illness. The work is able to be made up. Students have access to Google Classroom, and we understand that there is no instruction like in-person instruction, so we understand that they may need some reteaching or they may need some extra time. That's always granted for our students who are returning from a suspension. So we hope, we can't control what goes on in the home when students are on suspension, but we are hoping that they are logging on to Google Classroom and keeping up with their classwork as best that they can. When they return from a suspension, we know that returning from a suspension, especially because a lot of our students receive a suspension, and coming back from that is very stressful for some of them, and we want to make sure that we support them returning. So we provide a reintegration process. At my school, and I know many other schools do this, we do a reentry meeting where we have a counselor, an administrator, parents, and maybe whatever teacher or staff member was involved in that behavior incident, they will be present at that meeting. During that meeting, we support that student. We explain to them that their peers may have questions about where they've been, so we give them some strategies for responding to those peers. We also let them know that whatever discipline, whatever consequence they received is their own business. They don't have to tell anybody, and we give them some strategies and some suggestions for dealing with those questions. We also let kids know that we never want a child to feel like they're a bad kid. Good kid, bad choice is what I always say. Good kid, bad choice, and we move on from there. So this is a fresh start. We don't dwell on that. I let kids know that I'm glad that they're back. I'm happy to see them. And I'm not going to think about their discipline or their behavior moving forward. So I want them to get a fresh start.
Hi, I'm Charles Bibbs. I'm one of the assistant principals at Wabanzi Valley High School. So thank you all that are sitting here for coming out. And I know you have questions, but afterwards we can chat. And I look around this room and I see all these beautiful signs. Work hard and be nice to people. Welcome, kindness, and all this. And my question talks about how do you support other students that are impacted by a behavioral incident? At Wabanzi Valley High School, and I know I can speak for the other 4 high schools because we have Gail McKenzie as well, that one thing we promote is proactive engagement with our students and staff. We consider ourselves a family. We include you in that whole process. Okay, and something that happens and a child is sort of traumatized by it as an outside piece, we have what's called the house systems in high school. Are you guys familiar with that are sitting here? So in the house system at the high school, there's a counselor, there's a psychologist, there's a dean, and there's secretaries there to manage your student throughout the 4 years they're with us. So if there's an episode, if they're feeling a little anxious about something that happened and they let us know, that whole team is there to support them. And it goes on beyond that because the Youth 360 that you heard about in some of the messages here, that's at the high school as well. So there are additional supports, and Youth 360 will even take it outside of school if you choose to do so. But how do we support them? Remind them. They're all part of our family. And we see them in the hallways every single day. We see them in their classrooms every day. And we talk to them about that, and they see us model that. I mean, some of those, and they're good about coming to us because they do feel as if they're part of that family. And they do trust that they're part of that family. And we're building that each and every day throughout the high schools. Thank you.
We'll move into, this question came from one of our parents. Why does the district discipline both students the same even when it's clear that one student was targeting the other?
And I apologize, I forgot to introduce myself. I'm Leslie Mitchell, I'm the principal of Gregory. So this is not always true. I know it seems like that, but we consider many factors when determining the consequences for all students. So I know this seems to me like, the first example I think of is when a fight happens and one student started it and then it erupted into a fight. And that does happen. And yes, a lot of times one student starts it. But we have to consider the safety hazard that incident caused. And when determining, sometimes one student gets a greater consequence than the other, and sometimes they get the same consequence. Because we have to consider the safety hazard it caused. We also have to consider, did the student who didn't start it, was there an opportunity to get help? Was there an opportunity to get away? Those are things that we really consider. Was there a way to get out? And we want to make sure that if this caused a huge safety hazard to our school, we have to make sure that we respond appropriately. And in some cases, that means both students will get the same consequence, and in some cases, that means students may get different consequences. So that's kind of from a middle school perspective. I don't know if you guys have different perspectives. We don't see a ton of fights at the middle school level, but maybe as they get older.
Let me provide a little clarity. Once again, Charles Bibbs from Waubonsie Valley High School, and I'm speaking for the other 4 high schools as well. We don't have many physical altercations either. Okay, we are very, very proud of that, extremely proud. And what our deans are doing this, and they started this, I think, last year and the year before. At the high school level, we have like 4 deans each, and they kind of manage the alpha slice, and that I think NEQA has by grade level. Is that right, sir? Yes, okay. So they manage their house, and in that you got 4. So what they're doing now, they provide a collaborative means. They all meet each quarter to kind of go through this process, what works well and what doesn't work when you're managing students. And that's what they consider that, when you're being proactive to engage them and provide new learning experiences. Because as one of my teammates says, sometimes this is a poor choice, but we always teach them how to make better choices. And we always want to include the family and see our goal throughout this process with you and any of our family members is when we walk away from a scenario, we want to create a partnership. We want you to be part of that process, and we want you to help us own whatever that thing is that we need to adjust and help that student grow.
Thank you, sir. Anyone else? Okay, our next question. What is the protocol when there are students that are having conflict with one another and the school staff is aware because one of the students involved has spoken to several staff members?
I was actually very excited to respond to this question because what this tells me is that when this happens, it demonstrates that the school has set up a safe and comfortable environment that a child feels like he or she can come to an adult and let them know that there's something bothering them or that there is something happening. And that goes back to what's been talked about previously, and that is the culture and climate of our buildings. Making sure that we have engaged with our students and built relationships and trusting relationships where they feel like they can come to us for help when they need it. Also, our SEL lessons, social emotional lessons, really teach our students how to handle conflict. And one of the strategies that it talks about is if you have used your strategies and they are not working, you can seek the help of an adult. So this is another example of obviously a child from this question has reached out to somebody for help. Our staff is incredibly proactive. So if a child does reach out and share that something is happening or something's bothering them, that does not fall on deaf ears. To Leslie's point, we have a cadre of people, and depending on the situation, somebody is going to respond to that child, find out what is happening, what is bothering them, what is concerning them, and that will maximize students feeling as though that they can trust in us and that we will follow up and support them and get to the bottom of what it is that is potentially happening or going to happen.
Okay. And what is the protocol when a student has posted a video or picture of another student that they had an altercation with without that student's permission? That never happens at high school.
So this happens, especially in this world of social media, which is often kind of what consumes a lot of our days. So, you know, we cannot control what's happening on social media outside of school, but sometimes that does bleed into the school day and it causes a disruption. So we respond to that. And our first, line of defense is to let the parents know what was posted. We often get screenshots of things that were posted online. That is helpful. What I tell kids is if you receive a screenshot, do not share it unless you're sharing it with an adult. Especially if they receive something very inappropriate, do not share that, do not show it to anybody, do not send it to anybody, but bring it to an adult. In those cases, a lot of times with social media, we involve our school resource officers. Again, like I said before, these types of situations, they can be very sensitive, so I am talking to my assistant principals, I'm talking to Brad Hillman, and making sure that we are crossing our T's and dotting our I's, because we want to make sure that everybody is protected, because social media and privacy can be very, sensitive for a lot of people. So we want our kids to feel protected. I would say it's a lot of education during our in middle school, and I'm sure the same thing happens for high school and elementary. We are talking about digital citizenship and helping students understand the responsibility that it takes to have a device. They have a computer in their hands at all times, and with that comes a lot of power, and with that comes a lot of responsibility. So as a parent myself, I'm constantly checking my kids' phones and doing that. And making sure that I don't find anything. Usually when I check my kids' phones, I'm going to find something that I'm like, oh, why did you post that? But it's a learning experience for our kids. Just like conflict, the question before, in middle school, in school, they're going to experience conflict. It's how we help them deal with that and how we help them work through that and hopefully get them to problem solve on their own. And the same goes for the social media nightmare, is what I like to call it. They will soon realize that the things that they post will not go away and can often get them into some trouble that they may have to deal with for a long time to come.
Thank you very much. There were some questions that came in tonight that I'm going to just put out there and see who would like to respond to them. The first question is, if a student engages in physical relationships and that affects their education at school, despite coaching from parents at home, what interventions can be used to make the teen understand the wrong choices they are making? I'll repeat, if a student engages in physical relationships and that affects the education at school, despite coaching from parents at home, what interventions can be used to make the teen understand the wrong choices they are making?
Thank you, Dr. Talley, and thank you for the parent or group that sent that question in, because in high school it is a question, it is a concern. Making good choices. And according to that question, they say, what would you do if the episode happened? So in past practices, we've had episodes, but I think that too with our parents, we reach out to them immediately. We let them know what's going on. And in the house system, again, at the high school level, okay, we have that support in the house system. We have Youth 360, and they gently go into it. And with the social workers, they get into it to a degree that makes the child feel, first of all, comfortable, because we get into that scenario. They've encountered so many people that have been giving them a little bit of a abrasive approach, because you're doing something, oh my gosh, and then when your parents find out what you were doing, what else could we do to you to make you feel worse than you already do? And the social workers move into that as a partner. They move into that as someone that they can kind of rely on, they can trust. And that's when we get a physical change, not physical change, but just actual change in that behavior. Because if we go at it too abrasively, they kind of go the opposite direction. It's unusual to say, but If we stay with them, social workers are with them, the house team is with them, we got Youth 360. The teens kind of get it. You know, oftentimes it was a poor choice. And with the parents' involvement, they grow from it. And we rarely see it repeated.
Thank you. At the school board meeting last year, we heard that there was going to be mental health clinics in 3 of our schools, and we are still moving forward with that. One of the things that we want to do is secure the therapist. We're working with a couple of outside organizations. I don't want to mention them now until we have them signed. Once we have them in place, we should be able to start that. We're hoping to have these mental health clinics in place sometime starting in October, which I know is right around the corner. So just wanted people to know that. 2 more questions that came forward. One, at what point does discipline happen for just the individual versus the entire class? For example, class missing recess due to a handful of students talking out of turn. 10 minutes late to lunch because teachers feel some kids won't settle down enough to walk in the hallway. I don't know who I'll turn this to.
Oh, yes, this comes up. We do not believe in group discipline. And that's hard sometimes, especially that can happen in a lunchroom too. You have 150 kids, and it's hard to tell which ones are the ones making all the noise. And so it's easy to say, all right, everybody put your head down for 5 minutes. You're losing 5 minutes of recess. And we really try to work with whether it's the teachers, playground supervisors, to really work really hard and diligently to identify who are the individuals that need the supports, redirection, consequences if that's the case, and that it should not be at the detriment of the whole class. And again, that gets complicated sometimes. It takes a lot of work and diligence to really identify and spend the time to identify who it is that is really, causing the disruption, and make sure that those are the students who have the support and consequences they need, so that not all students are penalized for the behaviors of a few.
Yeah, I will echo that, and I will just say that, at the middle school we have lunchrooms with 150 to 300 kids, and just like parents, we are guilty of dishing out an empty consequence to our children. You're going to be grounded until forever. I am also guilty of, because I couldn't tell which few kids in the lunchroom were not doing what I asked them to do, of punishing the entire lunchroom. It's a guilt. It's something that has happened, and I know it's something that all schools are working to avoid doing. But yes, I think Terry answered that question beautifully.
I'm happy to hear that these behavioral policies have the goal of keeping students in class. As I understand, this is the best for all students. I hear a lot of focus on support and best processes for the students with behavioral issues, but I'm wondering if any thought has been given to support for those students who were not part of the behavioral incident, but who witnessed these issues and can be traumatized by them.
Yes, this is important, and this happens. So we will have students in a classroom that witness something very traumatic. A practice that we do at Gregory is making sure that after a discipline incident happens, we are communicating with all the families in that class. So we send out communication to those families, and then we follow up with admin and some of our student services staff, social worker or counselor, go into that classroom and explain, first of all, tell the students that they did a very good job handling themselves, that we are very proud of them, that behavior is not something that is expected in school. It's not something that's of the norm. And we make sure that they understand that we're there to support them. If they need any help, we let them know where to go. We let them know that that can be scary, but we are working very hard to make sure that that does not happen again, and you can feel safe here.
There is one other question that we will not read because it was specific to a school. And so I don't know if anyone who wrote it tonight or who will be watching later on, I would say go to the principal of that school. I would also say whenever there is an issue involving discipline, speak with the school administration about that. He or she will be able to provide more details about why a decision was made and what happened. However, and this becomes frustrating, I know, to some parents, they will not be able to give you specific details about a child because it's confidential. And so I think everyone has to understand that. There are limits to what a principal is able to share, but he or she will be there to answer your questions regarding. Those were all the questions that people turned in either before tonight or tonight. I'll just make sure that there are no more. Do my wait time in my head. See, that's okay, sir. One question. Go ahead, sir.
Yeah, this is not for the behavioral level, but I would like to know, like, what is the IPSD 204 school system does to motivate the student for excellency in academic, and also the second thing is our school system is taking any feedback from the successful school system amongst the USA and applying those strategies here.
Do we want to, I don't know who wants to answer the first one about how we motivate children for excellence. I'm going to say it from this standpoint. I think in many ways the motivation comes from inside children. That's one. That's the best motivation possible. Two, we also know what parents do to motivate their children. Three, I think, and probably one of the greatest things that we have in Indian Prairie are our staff and how they motivate the children to excel. I have seen the engagement of staff with children. Children know they have someone that they can depend upon, someone they can trust, they can go to, and that what the staff are able to do to excite children, to ignite their curiosity is tremendous, and that the children want to do back for them. And so I think that is what truly helps to motivate our children, but I don't know if anyone else wants to say. Leslie?
I was going to say that relation piece also, but I also want to say that it's not just academics that motivates our kids. Being a well-rounded student involved in extracurriculars or sports, having some type of identity within that school, having a purpose in that school and feeling like they belong there, feeling like they're a part of something is also very motivating for our kids.
And I'll just add one more thing. This happens every minute of every school day within the classrooms. The feedback that teachers give and staff members give to students, whether it be academics, whether it be a positive behavioral choice, that motivates our students throughout their entire school day.
That's an excellent question. Our programming definitely is a motivator for our students, opportunities for them to take credits for college credit courses, for them to engage in internships, for them to earn their industry credentials, participating in governmental programs. We have students who run for office at the state level, as part of student government, and opportunities to engage in type of community service. So for our students, we promote these opportunities regularly, so they have their own sort of social media within every single building, splash pages, et cetera, where they can see the different possibilities for them. And there are also a lot of community partners who provide opportunities for our students. Like we have several of our high school students who sit on councils within Naperville and Aurora, looking at issues of equity, looking at environmental issues and discussing those and bringing that back into the classroom and getting some of their peers involved. So some of that authentic learning and things that come out of their own curiosity that they're allowed to bring back into the building, that we've created a forum for that, I think is also very motivating for them.
And to the last part of your question, I think we always try to compare ourselves to other school districts, both here in Illinois and across the country. We have members of our team, school district teachers, staff, who are participating in national conferences, able to share some of the great things that we're doing. I have, for example, my chief of HR and my deputy going to a conference to share what we're doing with regards to Grow Your Own program. Because of what was seen in a presentation that they did at a state level, and they were asked to go speak at a national conference. So we do look at what other people are doing. Ms. Rosenblum, Mr. Hillman, Dr. Howard went to a conference in Texas about student discipline to learn from there and brought back some of their suggestions. We talked about that at a board meeting a couple of meetings ago. So we look outward, we look inward to see what we can do to improve. Okay? I want to thank you all for coming tonight. This presentation will be on our website. I want to go back to what was said earlier tonight. It is about relationships. It's about ensuring that our children know that we're here to support them. I think, Leslie, you mentioned good children, bad decisions. And we've all done that as adults. We sometimes will make a bad decision. Doesn't mean that we're bad people. And what we try to communicate to our children is, you are a good child, but you made a wrong choice. How do we learn from it and grow from that going forward? And I hope tonight you learn what we go through, the process that's done in making decisions about student discipline. And I thank all of you for coming tonight. Have a good evening, everybody.